aircraft in a blue-black color that helped them blend in against the darkness of space, and the CIA aircraft received the more powerful Pratt & Whitney J75P13 engine that increased maximum altitude by 2,500 feet, 800 m, to 74,600 feet, 22,700 m. In April 1958, CIA source Semyonovich Popov told his handler George Kaiservalter that a senior KGB official had boasted of having full technical details of the U-2, leading Bissell to conclude the project had a leak. The source of the leak was never identified, although there was speculation that it was Lee Harvey Oswald, then a radar operator at a U-2 base in Japan. The Soviets developed their own overflight aircraft, variants of the Yak-25, which in addition to photographing various parts of the world through the early 1960s acted as a target for the new MiG-19 and MiG-21 interceptors to practice for the U-2. The Missile Gap, edit. Main article, Missile Gap. The successful launch of Sputnik 1 on the 4th of October, 1957 gave credence to Soviet claims about the progress of its intercontinental ballistic missile program, and began the Sputnik crisis in the United States. The U-2 intelligence caused Eisenhower to state in a press conference on the 9th of October that the launch did not raise my apprehensions, not one iota. But he refused to disclose the U-2's existence as he believed that the Soviets would demand the end of the flights. In December 1958, Khrushchev boasted that a Soviet missile could deliver a 5 megaton warhead 8,000 miles, 13,000 kilometers. Although the Soviets' SS-6 Sapwood missile program was actually stalled by technical failures, subsequent boasts, and U.S. Secretary of Defense Neil McElroy's statement in February 1959 to Congress that the Soviets might have a 3-to-1 temporary advantage in ICBMs during the early 1960s, caused widespread concern in the U.S. about the existence of a missile gap. The American intelligence community was divided, with the CIA suspecting technical delays but the USAF believing that the SS-6 was ready for deployment. Khrushchev continued to exaggerate the Soviet program's success, the missile gap concerns, and CIA and State Department support, caused Eisenhower to reauthorize one communist territory overflight in July 1959 after 16 months, as well as many errant flights along the Soviet border. British U-2 overflights were made in December and February 1960. The first one targeted a large segment of the railways in the Tyuratam test range area as ballistic missiles were expected to be deployed close to rail lines, as well as nuclear complexes and missile test sites. No sites were found. Neither flight proved or disproved the existence of a missile gap. The British flight's success contributed to Eisenhower's authorization of one overflight in April. By 1960, U-2 pilots were aware, Knudsen recalled, that Soviet surface-to-air missiles, SAMs, had improved and that overflights had become much riskier, but did not worry because dumb fighter pilots always think it's the other guy that's going to get hit. By this time the CIA had also concluded internally that Soviet SAMs had a high probability of successful intercept at 70,000 feet, 21,300 m, providing that detection is made in sufficient time to alert the site. Despite the much increased risk, the CIA did not stop the overflights as they were overconfident following the years of successful missions, and because of the strong demand for more missile site photographs. The U-2 was the major source of covert intelligence on the Soviet Union and had photographed about 15% of the country, producing almost 5,500 intelligence reports. The April flight was indeed tracked quickly, and Khrushchev said in his memoir that it should have been shot down by new SAMs, but the missile crews were slow to react. May 1960, U-2 shot down, edit. Main article, 1960 U-2 incident. U-2 Grand Slam flight plan on the 1st of May 1960, from CIA publication The Central Intelligence Agency and Overhead Reconnaissance. The U-2 and Oxcart programs, 1954-1974, declassified the 25th of June, 2013. Eisenhower authorized one more overflight, which was to be made no later than the 1st of May because the important Paris summit of the Big Four conference would begin on the 16th of May. The CIA chose for the mission, the 24th Deep Penetration Soviet Overflight, Operation Grand Slam, an ambitious flight plan for the first crossing of the Soviet Union from Peshawar, Pakistan to Bod, Norway. Previous flights had always exited in the direction from which they had entered. The route would permit visits to Tyuratam, Sverdlovsk, Kirov, Kotlaz, Severodvinsk, and Murmansk. It was expected, given good weather, to resolve missile, nuclear and nuclear submarine intelligence issues with one flight. Francis Gary Powers, the most experienced pilot with 27 missions, was chosen for the flight. After delays, the flight began on May Day, the 1st of May. This was a mistake because, as an important Soviet holiday, there was much less air traffic than usual. The Soviets began tracking the U-2 15 miles outside the border, and over Sverdlovsk, 4.5 hours into the flight. One of 3 Sa-2 missiles detonated behind the aircraft at 70,500 feet, near enough to cause it to crash. Another hit a Soviet interceptor attempting to reach the American aircraft. Powers survived the near miss and was quickly captured. The crash did not destroy the U-2 and the Soviets were able to identify much of the equipment. Bissell and other project officials believed that surviving a U-2 accident from above 70,000 feet was impossible, so they used the pre-existing cover story. On the 3rd of May, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, the successor to NACA, announced that one of its aircraft, making a high-altitude research flight in Turkey, was missing. The government planned to say, if necessary, that the NASA aircraft had drifted with an incapacitated pilot across the Soviet border. By remaining silent, Khrushchev lured the Americans into reinforcing the cover story until he revealed on the 7th of May that Powers was alive and had confessed to spying on the Soviet Union. Eisenhower turned down Dull's offer to resign and publicly took full responsibility for the incident on the 11th of May. By then all overflights had been cancelled. The Paris summit collapsed after Khrushchev, as the first speaker, demanded an apology from the US, which Eisenhower refused. U-2 pilots were told, Knudsen later said, if captured to tell them everything that they knew, because they were told little about their missions other than targets on maps. Otherwise, Powers had little instruction on what to do during an interrogation. Although he had been told that he could reveal everything about the aircraft since the Soviets could learn what they wanted from it, Powers did his best to conceal classified information while appearing to cooperate. His trial began on the 17th of August, 1960. Powers, who apologized on the advice of his Soviet Defense Council, was sentenced to 3 years in prison. But on the 10th of February, 1962 the USSR exchanged him and American student Frederick Pryor for Rudolf Abel at Gliernick Bridge between West Berlin and Potsdam, Germany. 2 CIA investigations found that Powers had done well during the interrogation and had complied with his obligations as an American citizen during this period. Although the government was reluctant to reinstate him to the USAF because of its statements that the U-2 program was civilian, it had promised to do so after CIA employment ended. Powers resolved the dilemma by choosing to work for Lockheed as a U-2 pilot. The debris of Powers' aircraft was used to design a copy under the name Berev S-13. That was then discarded in favor of the MiG-25R and reconnaissance satellites. The search for operational ballistic missile sites continued, focusing on the Soviet railway system using corona satellite images, with a resolution of 20 to 30 feet compared to 2 to 3 feet from U-2 cameras. Restructuring, edit. The U-2 shoot-down in 1960 paralyzed the U.S. reconnaissance community and forced changes in policy, procedures, and security protocol. The United States also had to move swiftly to protect its allies. For example, after the Soviets announced that Powers was alive, the CIA evacuated the British pilots from Detachment B as Turkey did not know of their presence in the country. The end of Soviet overflights meant that Detachment B itself soon left Turkey, and in July Detachment C left Japan following a Japanese governmental request. Both detachments merged into Detachment G, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel William Gregory, at Edwards Air Force Base, California, where the CIA had relocated the U-2 program after nuclear testing forced it to abandon Groom Lake in 1957. The CIA sought to determine if the U-2 could, from a fixed base at North Edwards, rapidly deploy to an advanced American base and complete reconnaissance flights on a largely self-sustaining basis. A proving exercise was arranged with Gregory and the new Detachment G unit to simulate deploying a U-2 unit overseas, taking 2 or 3 aircraft, and conducting 3 reconnaissance missions with no resupply. The exercise was critical to continued CIA operation of the U-2, since basing the aircraft in a foreign country was no longer an option. The exercise was completed with excellent results, and actual reconnaissance missions began to be scheduled immediately. On the 4th of January, 1961, the CIA U-2 reconnaissance effort, which was formerly known as Chalice, was redesignated Idealist. This program codeword by the end of the decade was being used to describe the U.S. reconnaissance along the Chinese coastline, while Taiwanese missions into the Chinese country would be known as the Idealist program. By the next U-2 flight, in October 1960 over Cuba, the previously informal procedure in which the President personally approved or disapproved each flight after discussion with advisors was replaced by the National Security Council Special Group. The expansion of satellite intelligence partly compensated for the overflight's end, but, because U-2 photographs remained superior to satellite imagery, future administrations considered resumption at times, such as during the Berlin crisis of 1961. Cuba, edit. Bay of Pigs invasion, edit. As many as 15 U-2 sorties provided support for the April 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba by the United States. Scientists such as Edwin H. Land, James Ryan Killian, who had originally conceived the U-2 and had advocated for its development and deployment as a tool of scientific reconnaissance, felt betrayed by the use of the U-2 for dirty tricks covert operations, such as the Bay of Pigs invasion. Richard M. Bissell, the CIA official in charge of both the U-2 program and CIA covert operations, including the Bay of Pigs invasion, had been a good friend of Land and Killian, but such use of the U-2s strained their friendship. From October 1960, Detachment G made many overflights of Cuba from Northland Air Force Base, Texas. Although Lockheed modified 6 CIA aircraft into the aerial refueling-capable U-2F model in 1961, permitting some Cuba missions to originate from Edwards, pilot fatigue limited flights to about 10 hours. An August 1962 flight showed Soviet Satu SAM sites on the island. Later overflights found more sites and MiG-21 interceptors. The increasing number of SAMs caused the United States to more cautiously plan Cuban overflights. USAF U-2s did not conduct overflights, but officials believed that it would be better for a military officer to be the pilot in case he was shot down. Following one last Cuba overflight that originated from Edwards and ended at McCoy Air Force Base, Florida on the 14th of October, 1962, all further U-2 operations over Cuba originated from a detachment operating location that was established at McCoy. Cuban Missile Crisis, edit. After receiving hasty training on the more powerful U-2F under the cognizance of the Weather Reconnaissance Squadron Provisional, WRSP-4, at Edwards AFB, Major Richard S. Hazer flew over western Cuba on the 14th of October, 1962 in a U-2F. His aircraft was the first to photograph Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles, MRBM, in San Cristobal before returning to McCoy AFB, Florida. Prior to the launch of all Cuban sorties, the two U-2F aircraft possessed by WSRP-4 and flown by 4,080th Strategic Reconnaissance Wing personnel had USAF insignia and tail numbers. SAC received permission to fly as many Cuban overflights as necessary for the duration of the resulting Cuban Missile Crisis. On the 27th of October sortie from McCoy AFB, one of the U-2Fs was shot down over Cuba by an SA-2 guideline surface-to-air missile, killing the pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson. He posthumously received the First Air Force Cross. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev was dismayed, warning President John F. Kennedy in a private message that U-2 overflights could inadvertently cause WIT. Is it not a fact that an intruding American plane could be easily taken for a nuclear bomber, which might push us to a fateful step? Fulfilling CIA officials' fears of a USAF takeover, CIA pilots never again flew over Cuba. SAC retained control over Cuban overflights, which continued until the 1970s under the code name Olympic Fire. At the same time as the Cuban crisis, Royal Air Force, RAF, English Electric Lightnings of the Air Fighting Development Squadron made several practice interceptions against U-2s, guided by ground controllers and using energy climb profiles. The Lightning could intercept the U-2 at up to 65,000 feet. Hickman Incident, edit. On the 28th of July, 1966, a U-2 piloted by USAF Captain Robert Hickman departed from Barksdale Air Force Base to conduct a reconnaissance mission. Hickman's orders included the requirement that he not enter Cuban airspace. As determined later by USAF investigators, trouble with the aircraft's oxygen system caused Hickman to lose consciousness. U.S. Navy pilot John Newlin, flying an F-4B assigned to VF-74, was scrambled from Naval Air Station Key West, ordered to intercept Hickman before he violated Cuban airspace, and, if necessary, shoot him down. Newlin could not reach the U-2 before flying closer than 12 miles from the Cuban coastline and so had to turn back. Hickman's U-2 flew across Cuba, ran out of fuel and crashed into a mountainside near Lancra, Bolivia. Hickman died in the crash, with the Bolivian military giving his remains an honor guard at a nearby chapel. The U.S. Embassy to Bolivia sent a team to investigate the crash site. From 1960 to 1965, U-2 flights originated or terminated on a nearly daily basis at Albrook USAF Base. In 1966, elements of the USAF's 4,080th Strategic Reconnaissance Wing flew U-2s from Albrook to perform atmospheric sampling as the French detonated a nuclear device in the South Pacific. Asia, edit. CIA overflights of Asian targets began in spring 1958 when Detachment C moved from Japan to Naval Air Station QB Point in the Philippines to overfly Indonesia during an uprising against Sukarno's guided democracy government. The CIA's civil air transport, aiding the rebels, so badly needed pilots that it borrowed 2 CIA U-2 pilots despite the high risk to the U-2 program if one were captured. The Indonesian government soon defeated the rebels, however, and the U-2s returned to Japan. That year, Detachment C also flew over the Chinese coast near Quemoy during the Second Taiwan Strait crisis to see if Communist Chinese forces were preparing to invade, and in 1959 aided CIA operations during the Tibetan Uprising. The unit was collecting high-altitude air samples to look for evidence of Soviet nuclear tests when it was withdrawn from Asia after the May 1960 U-2 incident. On the 24th of September 1959, an unmarked U-2, Article 360, crash-landed to Fujisawa Airfield, JP, of Japan. Armed American security forces in plainclothes soon arrived and moved away locals at gunpoint, increasing public interest in the crash. The unlawfulness of the Black Jet incident, JP, was criticized in Japan's House of Representatives. The same Article 360 was later shot down in the May 1960 U-2 incident. A month before the incident, another U-2 crash landed in rural Thailand. Locals helped the U.S. remove the aircraft without publicity. Detachment G pilots began using the unmarked Taiwanese Detachment HU-2 for North Vietnam overflights in February 1962, but as tactical intelligence became more important, after the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution of August 1964, SAC took over all U-2 missions in Indochina. In late November 1962, Detachment G was deployed to Takli Royal Thai Air Force Base, Thailand, to carry out overflights of the Chinese-Indian border area after Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru requested military aid following the Sino-Indian War in October-November 1962. In 1963, India agreed to an American request for a permanent U-2 base for Soviet and Chinese targets, offering Sharbatia, although it was only briefly used and Takli remained Department G's main nation base. After the Vietnamese ceasefire in January 1973 prohibited American military flights, CIA pilots again used the unmarked Detachment HU-2 over North Vietnam during 1973 and 1974. Several U-2s were lost over China. In 1963, the CIA started Project Whale Tail to develop carrier-based U-2Gs to overcome range limitations. During the development of the capability, CIA pilots took off and landed U-2Gs on the aircraft carrier Ranger and other ships. The U-2G was used only twice operationally. Both flights from Ranger occurred in May 1964 to observe France's development of an atomic bomb test range at Mururoa in French Polynesia. Vietnam War, edit. In early 1964, SAC sent a detachment of U-2s from the 4080th to South Vietnam for high-altitude reconnaissance missions over North Vietnam. On the 5th of April, 1965, U-2s from the 4028th Strategic Reconnaissance Squadron, SRS, took photos of SAM-2 sites near Hanoi and Haiphong Harbor. On the 11th of February, 1966, the 4080th Wing was redesignated the 100th Strategic Reconnaissance Wing, 100 SRW, and moved to Davis Monthan AFB, Arizona. The detachment at BNHOAAB, South Vietnam, was redesignated the 349th SRS. The only loss of a U-2 during combat operations occurred on the 9th of October, 1966, when Major Leo Stewart, flying with the 349th Strategic Reconnaissance Squadron, developed mechanical problems high over North Vietnam. The U-2 managed to return to South Vietnam where Stewart ejected safely. The U-2 crashed approximately 65 miles, 105 kilometers, east-northeast of Saigon in Viet Cong, VC, territory. A special forces team was later sent to destroy the wreckage. One member stated that they retrieved classified radar jammers from the wreckage before they could be captured by the VC and possibly transferred to the USSR. In July 1970, the 349th SRS at BNHOA moved to Thailand and was redesignated the 99th SRS in November 1972, remaining there until March 1976. U-2 carrier operations, edit. At one time, in an effort to extend the U-2's operating range and to eliminate the need for foreign government approval for U-2 operations from USAF bases in foreign countries, it was suggested that the U-2 be operated from aircraft carriers. 3 aircraft were converted for carrier operations by the installation of arrestor hooks, and carrier-qualified naval aviators were recruited to fly them. It turned out to be possible to take off and land a U-2 from a carrier. Testing in 1964 with the USS Ranger and in 1969 with the USS America proved the concept. The only operational carrier use occurred in May 1964 when a U-2, operating from USS Ranger, was used to spy on a French atomic test in the Pacific. The Lockheed C-130 was also tested for carrier use to support U-2C deployments. In 1969, the larger U-2Rs were flown from the carrier America. The U-2 carrier program is believed to have been halted after 1969. 1972,000, edit. In August 1970, 2 U-2Rs were deployed by the National Reconnaissance Office, NRO, to cover the Israeli-Egypt conflict under the code name Even Steven. In June 1976, the U-2s of the 100 SRW were transferred to the 9th Strategic Reconnaissance Wing, 9 SRW, at Beale Air Force Base, California, and merged with SR-71 aircraft operations there. When the Strategic Air Command, SAC, was disbanded in 1992, the wing was transferred to the new Air Combat Command, ACC, and redesignated the 9th Reconnaissance Wing, 9RW. In 1977, a U-2R was retrofitted with an upward-looking window so that it could be used for high-altitude astronomical observations of the cosmic microwave background, CMB. This experiment was the first to measure definitively the motion of the galaxy relative to the CMB and established an upper limit on the rotation of the universe as a whole. In 1984, during a major NATO exercise, RAF Flight Lieutenant Mike Hale intercepted a U-2 at a height of 66,000 feet, 20,100 m, where the aircraft had previously been considered safe from interception. Hale climbed to 88,000 feet, 26,800 m, in his Lightning F-3. In 1989, a U-2R of 9th Reconnaissance Wing, RW, Detachment 5, flying out of Patrick Air Force Base, Florida successfully photographed a space shuttle launch for NASA to assist in identifying the cause of tile loss during launch, which had been discovered in the initial post-Challenger missions. On the 2nd of January, 1993, an Iraqi MiG-25 Foxbat attempted to intercept a USAF U-2 taking part in UN operations over Iraq. The R-40, AA-6 Acrid, missile missed the U-2 and the MiG was chased off by F-15 Eagles. On the 19th of November, 1998, a NASA U-2 research aircraft set a world record for altitude of 20,479 meters, 67,190 feet, in horizontal flight in the 12,000 to 16,000 kilograms, 20